Mr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you all for being here today. Appreciate your time. I'm glad we're having this hearing to examine really the unprecedented levels of fraud in the pandemic unemployment programs. You know, I often think about our job here, and in situations like this, I think of the song America the Beautiful, where we ask God to help us mend our every flaw. And I think this is a perfect example of us trying to do that. Mr. Turner, thank you for clarifying today, too, the difference between improper payments and fraud itself. 191 billion, I believe, is what's reported out from DOL. You know, in my home state of Ohio, it's estimated $1 billion may have been paid in fraudulent unemployment claims from March 2020 to June 2022. And the problem is so rampant that our own governor, Mike DeWine, and his wife, Fran, and our lieutenant governor, John Husted, were notified that fraudulent claims had been filed in their own names. It went that far. So it's a widespread problem. It harms Americans that it was designed to help, and obviously we don't want that. That's a given. So many of my Republican colleagues have been committed to protecting Americans who have been victims of this fraud. In fact, when this committee was in markup for the American Rescue Plan, I offered an amendment to require the IRS to implement a hold harmless process for those taxpayers whose 1099-Gs are flagged as unreported income if those taxpayers believe they are victims of identity theft or fraud, such that no penalties or interest would accrue against them. This amendment was objected to by one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. At that time, Ranking Member Neal promised that if I withdrew my amendment, we would work together to address this issue. Unfortunately, it hadn't ever happened. And Mr. Chairman, with your consent, I'd like to submit a copy of my amendment on that for the record.
Without objection.
And so I will say that despite not really investigating the root cause of the fraud during the pandemic, we saw the Department of Labor has distributed $2 billion in the American Rescue Plan to detect and prevent fraud, promote equitable access, and ensure the timely payment of benefits with respect to unemployment compensation programs. The Department of Labor has yet to provide a full accounting of how this funding has been used. I think we need to circle our wagons there. And the only available information that I've seen shows DOL has only used 18% of those funds for fraud identification and recovery. So, Mr. Turner, do you have any data currently on how many taxpayers had their identities stolen to claim IU benefits fraudulently? Is there any tracking the IRS does to aggregate information from the Form 1099-G about the amount of taxable unemployment benefits that were flagged by states or individuals as fraudulent? I think it's an important piece of the puzzle, so if you could help me there, I appreciate it.
Yes, this is still early in the stage. We're still gathering the data on that.
Okay.
But it is part of our plan. We hope to do that this year, but because of constraints, we've pushed it off to next year. But we do have plans to do so.
I appreciate that. As soon as we can, that would be helpful information for us. The state of Ohio has been able to recover more than $390 million in unemployment benefits. And despite the work being done by the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services and our participation in the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, Ohio is not receiving any portion of the funding they have recovered, the majority of which are pandemic unemployment assistance and federal pandemic unemployment compensation funds. So they're really trying to do their work. You know, states like Ohio are making investments in fraud recovery and prevention efforts as they continue to recover these fraudulent payments. I think we should be working to incentivize their investments in these recovery efforts. Mr. Turner, what thoughts do you have on any policy recommendations that would incentivize states to pursue the fund recovery work? And you may have mentioned this earlier, and I apologize if I'm asking a question again.
Not a problem. That is one of the recommendations that the Department of Labor have, and we concur with that recommendation. We think anything that will incentivize and help people be more interested in recovering those funds is a great move.
What would you suggest that incentive look like?
Well, 5% I think is what they're proposing.
Okay.
And we would agree with that. The only caveat that we would add on that is that it be returned back to the UI program, administration of it.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, with your consent, I'd like to submit a letter from Ohio Governor DeWine to the Secretary of Labor, Martin Walsh, for the record.
With no objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative.